Hi students, in this video lecture we're going to talk about a famous person when it comes to population concepts and theories. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he actually wasn't a geographer, he was an economist, but he wrote an essay on the principles of population way back in 1798. And in 1798 he was in Europe, and in 1798 the Industrial Revolution was kicking off. It was in the early stages, and so there was a transition happening in the world around him, and he made some observations about society and population that were very, very dire. He made predictions that were dire based on his observations about what was happening in the population around him. Okay, so remember in the demographic transition model in stage 3 and 4, you really see the natural increase rate of the population explode because people are still having babies and people are living longer, so the crude birth rate is high, the crude death rate is getting lower, and so the population booms. And at those times when he was alive, in history, we human beings were still doing our agriculture with our hands and with simple tools and animals to help us, beasts of burden we call them. But there wasn't widespread use of steam engines yet, any kind of mechanized machines, mechanized things that helped us increase our productivity, increase the yield in a particular place at a particular time. And so agriculture was a steady thing, a huge part of our population. In sociology class, I talk about how so many people before the Industrial Revolution changed everything. That's what revolution means. So many people during the hands-on agricultural phase of Western culture, we had jobs in nature. We had jobs in the environment dealing directly with some kind of aspect of contributing to our food supply. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a division of labor. That doesn't mean that the farming community didn't need a teacher or didn't need somebody to run a wood mill or didn't need somebody to have a store or there wasn't a doctor or a dentist or these kinds of things. There certainly were those kinds of things, but those people had jobs in those fields because farming existed and because agriculture was the predominant profession that people went into. They had to. We had to feed ourselves. And because we were feeding ourselves so nicely with a predictable amount of food and a surplus each time, our population was growing by leaps and bounds. And so Thomas Malthus was observing the world in the late 1700s, and he observed that the way that we did agriculture would produce a steady food supply, but it stayed pretty steady, and if it increased, it only increased in small increments over time, and our population was shooting up. And so he predicted that our agriculture, the way that we did it, it couldn't keep up with the boom in population that was happening because of the agricultural revolution. The boom in population happened before the Industrial Revolution took place. And so population increased so rapidly that he predicted really, really dire things about the population on the earth, that agriculture was not going to be able to keep up. And what if there was a famine and it ruined our agriculture for a year or two and we didn't have the same amount? It was going to cause disease and starvation and horrible poverty. He really predicted terrible things about the booming population and the limitations that he observed on the food supply. And at his snapshot in history, those things were observable facts that were part of the record that he could look at in history. Like, these records were kept, and so he could look at these records. And so he had some suggestions. He got a lot of flack for this. He was attacked by religious leaders. He really did not get a good reputation for his theories. But he, for instance, called for things such as women should wait at least 10 years before they got married. There wasn't contraception at the time, and so women should wait at least 10 years before they get married. Women should maybe go get an education before they get married. Do something worthwhile before before they begin to have children, because if you get married at 28 instead of 18, well, that's 10 years of less childbearing that you're going to have in your fertility cycle. And so he promoted stuff like that. He also, at times, not in his essay on the theory of population, but in other writings, he advocated for things like homosexual relationships because they didn't produce children. He advocated for a lot of social conditions that nowadays folks wouldn't find controversial at all in some cases, but because of his day and time, his suggestions for how to control the population were extremely, I guess, marginal and controversial at least. Okay, so he caught a lot of flack. As a matter of fact, if y'all have seen the Marvel movies, if you have, you'll know a villain named Thanos. And if you look at the storyline in that movie, Thanos essentially is a modern day Thomas Malthus. He wants to eliminate the population, but there's a twist. It's not necessarily because agriculture couldn't keep up with the food needs of a population, but it's a Neo-Malthusian point of view that you find so often, not just in cartoon characters like Thanos, but you'll hear folks like Bill Gates and other people in the public eye, like other pop cultural figures. The United Nations is all for controlling population. You'll hear about all sorts of population interventions that are happening all over the world to try to decrease the birth rate. So this day and age, Neo-Malthusians don't take his predictions and his theories precisely word for word, but they take his concepts and apply it instead of agriculture can't keep up with our needs and it's going to be horrific when we have, a famine or something. We're going to see terrible suffering and death. Thomas Malthus really would have enjoyed the observing the COVID pandemic that went around the world, because he was all for a good pandemic to wipe out a big portion of the population. Useless eaters, that he would have called them. So anyway, he had a lot of villain kind of tendencies in some of his suggestions, but he was looking at a macro scale. He was not hoping that you specifically would die. He was looking at the population, a very generic thing without a personality, without individual personalities involved. He was looking at the whole population and said, a great pandemic, a great famine, or a blight on the crops that caused the starvation and caused death from that, or caused a disease that was not controllable, so a bunch of us died. He would have said that was a great correction mechanism to get everything back in balance. And neo-Malthusians these days look at climate change and the effect that a human population has on climate as a similar call to what Malthus did way back in his day. We need to control our population. We need to modify our food supply, not eat so much meat. There are some memes that you can find right now online with Bill Gates especially holding up no meat signs. And so that's one of the techniques, one of the strategies that folks today are trying to call for. They're trying to encourage people to cut back on the amount of meat that they're eating, because that contributes to climate change, cut down on the amount of energy that they're using, because that contributes to climate change. And so neo-Malthusians use some of the same concepts, but they've modified it for the modern day, where we have had an industrial revolution that has taken the place of our labor on the farm. We've had a reproductive revolution that has introduced contraception into societies. Thomas Malthus would be all for that. And we have also had an educational revolution where you've got education as an initiative that people work toward worldwide to increase the health of a population, decrease the birth rate in a population, and increase the standard of living overall, and therefore life expectancy also for people worldwide. We've got diseases under control. Thomas Malthus could not envision a time in in which the Industrial Revolution would not only change agriculture's dominant focus in everybody's life, but we have had many industrial revolutions and a green revolution since then, which has taken food supply or food production into science, where you can actually create meat, for instance, in a laboratory. There's a company in Memphis, Tennessee. I can't remember the name of it right now. Is it Beyond Meat? I don't think that's the one that's in Memphis, Tennessee, but there's a lab in Memphis, Tennessee that is taking a couple of little cells from a chicken, and they can make a chicken breast out of this stuff. And you and I wouldn't be able to analyze it, like which one is from a quote real chicken and which one is not from a real chicken, right? Stuff like this. Impossible burgers with plant products that satisfy that taste that we have for beef in a hamburger. I don't know whether it actually satisfies or not. I've never tried one. We don't eat a whole bunch of that in my house anyway. But anyway, the Neo-Malthusians use the same theory that Thomas Malthus had, the same mindset and trajectory about negative consequences of huge populations. So they take these general ideas and apply it to the social issues that happen globally in our day and age. Thomas Malthus never could have fathomed the concept of a global connection between places and people. The Industrial Revolution has certainly, and the additional revolutions after that, has certainly created a situation where we can look to places like India or Pakistan for the to be a predominant rice supplier for the world. We can look at places like Ukraine, which is in the news a lot right now for the conflict, but they have always been known as like the bread box of that part of the world, because you can make anything grow there, and they grow a lot of the world's wheat supply, for instance. And so we can certainly grow those things here in the United States. Stuttgart is right down the highway from me, and that's one of the rice capitals in the world. But we can certainly produce a lot of our own stuff. But Stuttgart, I believe, you can look this up, I think 80% of the rice that is produced there through Riceland Rice is exported to other places in the world. And a lot of the wheat that we use, especially for pasta, if I have this right, if I'm remembering this right without looking at my notes, a lot of the wheat we use, I believe, comes from Ukraine, for instance. And avocados, we can't grow those all the time for ourselves, but they're in every Kroger and Walmart and Edwards Food Giant that you go into. And this is because of the global connection with places where the climate supports that kind of harvest year round. The Levant, which is Syria and Lebanon, over off the Mediterranean coast in the mountains, wonderful wine producing area and olive oil producing area. And California, of course, has some of the same characteristics. So we get wine and olive oil from there also, and a lot of citrus, all these different kinds of things. All of the variety that's in our grocery stores today that we have come to know and love is really contributing, according to data that many climate activists propose, according to data that they can show, just transporting the stuff from one side of the globe to the next certainly creates a lot of stress on our environment, on our climate, on our weather systems, on the planet, if you will. And so Thomas Malthus is sort of the grandpa of the activism that you see around us in the world today, based on population and a booming population being a negative thing for the planet, as a Neo-Malthusian would say, and population back here going unchecked is a negative thing for us in general, because his claim was agriculture couldn't keep up. And of course, he did not envision those modern advances that enabled agriculture to keep up. But those modern advances that enabled agriculture to keep up is what Neo-Malthusians cite as problematic, and that we need to find some sort of happy medium. And so population control is one of the mechanisms that is being used in the efforts to try to fix the climate changes that are observable in data that's collected throughout the world. So read in your textbook about this and look at how it corresponds to the demographic transition model, the epidemiological transition model. And also, I've got a video for you in our weekly folder that is a quick animation. I've curated this video, and it's a quick animation of population growth throughout the world so that you can see the map, and you can see the bubbles come up to show how populations, when and how and where and why populations boomed in different places. And so I will see you in the next video. Bye.